Hello dear participants, I welcome you all here in this summary lecture today. As we all know that this is the last lecture of this certificate course, and in this last lecture we are going to very briefly discuss on the topics or the contents which we tried to cover during this certificate course. So let me start with the week number 1, what contents or what topics that we tried to cover here in week 1. So in week 1 we started with the introduction, then we went for basic vocabularies where we tried to make you familiar with the universe, population and sample, the basic terminologies. Then we shifted to the introduction to variable and data. Then we shifted to measurement of scale where we tried to make you familiar with the nominal, ordinal, interval and ratio scale. And then we shifted to introduction to statistical techniques where we tried to make you familiar with the different statistical techniques. The major objective of week 1 was to make you familiar with the different measurement skills and the different statistical techniques. Moreover, uh, we also wanted to make you familiar with the fact that we cannot give any statistical treatment to any type of the data or any type of the variables. First, we need to identify that what type of variable that we are having, whether it is a nominal, ordinal or scale, and then accordingly we need to choose appropriate statistical technique. Fine. So all this part we have discussed in week 1. Then in week 2 we started with introducing you MS Excel and SPSS, and here in week 2 we also tried to make you familiar with the data cleaning, coding and few basic functions that also we tried to perform here in the week 2. The basic objective of week 2 was to make you familiar with the basic functioning of MS Excel and SPSS, and that is why here in week 2 we perform few functions in MS Excel and few functions in SPSS. Moreover, we used or we demonstrated few data cleaning techniques like identifying the blank cells, identifying error cells or removing the duplicates and so on and so forth. So the objective of week 2 was to make you all familiar with the basic functioning of the MS Excel and SPSS. Then we shifted to week 3, and in week 3 we started with the descriptive statistics here. And in descriptive statistics, in initial 3 lectures we demonstrated you that how can we construct the frequency tables or the and cross tables and stem and leaf display here in MS Excel and SPSS. And in the last 2 lectures of the week 3 we tried to make you familiar with the visualization of categorical data, more specifically the nominal and ordinal data. Here in this lecture number 13 we tried to make you familiar with the construction of the column, bar chart and pie chart. And in the last lecture of week 3 uh, we tried to make you familiar with the construction of the histograms for the scale data. So the major objective of week 3 was to make you familiar with the process part, the process to construct the frequency tables, cross tables, stem and leaf plot, column, bar chart, pie chart and histogram. Then we started with the week 4, and in week 4 we started with the reading and interpretation of the table, because as I mentioned earlier that we cannot construct any table for any type of the data or any type of the variable. For nominal and ordinal we can construct the frequency table or say that the cross table. For the scale data we need to go for the stem and leaf plot. So all that part, how can we give meaning to these tables, that we have discussed here in this lecture. Then we shifted to the reading and interpretation of the chart output in SPSS, and then we started with the numerical treatments here in the lecture number 17. Here in this lecture number 17 we just demonstrated how to obtain the numerical values for the descriptive statistical those concepts. Fine. So the process part we have covered here. Once we obtained the values, then we started with the meaning of those statistical terminologies or the descriptive statistical techniques. And for that, here we started with the meaning of the central tendencies first. First, we tried to understand the meaning of central tendencies, and then in the next lecture, we tried to understand that how can we read and interpret the those values which we have computed here in the lecture number 17. So here the objective of week 4 was to make you all familiar with the reading and interpretation of the tables and charts. Moreover, to make you all familiar with the meaning and interpretation of the central tendencies. Now in the next week, in the week 5, we started with the meaning of partition value, which is also a part of the descriptive statistics. Then after understanding the meaning of partition values, we shifted to the reading and interpretation of partition values. Then we tried to understand the meaning of dispersion, and then we tried to understand that how can we read and interpret the dispersion values. And in the last lecture of week 5, we have seen that what is the skewness and kurtosis, and how to obtain the values and how to give meaning to those values. So the major objective of week 5 was to make you all familiar with the partition values like quartile 1, quartile 2, quartile 3, decile, percentile, to make you all familiar with the dispersion values, that is max, mean, range, standard deviation, quartile deviation, to make you all familiar with the skewness and kurtosis, and in kurtosis more specifically leptokurtic, mesokurtic and platykurtic. What's the meaning of all these terminologies and how to give meaning to the values which we obtain here in MS Excel and SPSS. So in summary, week 4, week number 4 and week number 5, they both explains us the descriptive statistical techniques. Descriptive statistical techniques. They are associated with the descriptive statistical techniques. Now, as we move forward and as we enter into week 6, we'll find that we started here with the inferential statistics, and in which in lecture number 26 we have given the introduction to hypothesis testing, where we dealt with the basic terminologies of the hypothesis. Here we tried to make you familiar with the meaning of hypothesis and what actually we test here in the hypothesis testing. All that part that we have discussed in the lecture number 26. Initial 2 lectures are the basic introductory lectures. Then from lecture number 27 onward, we started actually demonstrating the hypothesis test. So here lecture number 27, lecture number 28 and lecture number 29, we performed t-test. More specifically, one sample t-test, independent samples t-test and dependent paired samples t-test. So the objective of week number 6 was to make you all familiar with the hypothesis testing, and more specifically we performed few parametric tests, and they are one sample t-test, independent samples t-test and dependent paired samples t-test. In the next week, week number 7, we went further for the hypothesis testing, and we performed one-way analysis of variance, two-way analysis of variance. Then we performed chi-square hypothesis testing, and this is one of the non-parametric tests. Then we shifted to correlation coefficient, partial correlation. This correlation coefficient is a very essential part for the regression analysis. So first we explained you the correlation coefficient, and in the next week we went for the regression part. So the basic objective here in the week 7 was to make you all familiar with the one way between groups analysis of variance, two way between groups analysis of variance, and one non-parametric test, popular non-parametric test, chi-square test, and to make you all familiar with the correlation and partial correlation. Then we moved to the last week, week number 8 of this certificate course, and week 8 we started with the simple linear regression equation. And in this lecture we tried to understand first what is regression, what is dependent variable, independent variable, and how to construct the model. All that part that we discussed here in this lecture. Then in the next lecture we tried to make you familiar with the multiple linear regression equation, and then we shifted to the test of reliability. More specifically, here we discussed on the Cronbach alpha, and then we shifted to the last part of this certificate course, where in the lecture number 38 we discussed on the export of SPSS result, because whenever we perform the statistical treatment on any type of the data, we get the results in the form of tables and the charts here in the SPSS output window. To analyze or to describe these tables or the charts, we need to export that result into the other format. So how to export all these results, that we have discussed in the lecture number 38, and now we are here in the last lecture of this certificate course, that is a summary lecture. So this is the way that we try to cover different concepts, contents or the topics here in this certificate course. So this certificate course tried to address few questions. And what are those questions? Question number 1. This certificate course tried to address question number 1, that is how to solve research question treating your data statistically. So this certificate course tried to make you familiar with the statistical treatment. Second question, which statistical technique to use on collected data, that part also we tried to discuss, we tried to make it clear. Then the third question, why to use that specific technique for that specific data, that also we tried to address here in the week 2 or 3 somewhere. Then question number 4, do we really need to remember formulas every time we treat the data? It is not always necessary, that already we have seen. It is not always necessary to remember the formulas. Simply you need to know the process, and simply you need to know the meaning of that particular statistical technique, because you need to give meaning to the value which you have obtained using SPSS or MS Excel. Then the next question, how to use MS Excel and SPSS for statistical treatment and to get the result. So the process part, that also we have addressed in our certificate course. Why do we make hypothesis statement? That also we have seen. How can we construct correct hypothesis statement? It depends on what type of the statistical hypothesis test that you are choosing. Whether you are choosing T-stat or F-stat or chi-square stat. Moreover, it depends on which specific test you are choosing, one sample t-test or two sample t-test or independent sample t-test or paired sample t-test. So what type of test you are choosing, it depends on that. How to construct the hypothesis test, it depends on that. How to test hypothesis, the process part again, that also we have addressed in our this certificate course. How to interpret results from the hypothesis testing, yes, that also we have covered, that also we have addressed during this certificate course. And how to give the correct meaning to the result, that also we have discussed in those respective lectures. And the last question, how to reach correct conclusion and decision in research, that also part we tried to address here in this certificate course. Now let me take you to the correct decision in research, the last question. Fine. So if we apply appropriate statistical technique for the appropriate variable, then we are committing the correct decision and will get the appropriate conclusions or the correct conclusions. So if we are having the appropriate variables and if we are applying, if we are performing the appropriate statistical technique, then we are going to commit the correct decision and we are going to get the appropriate conclusions. Now suppose if I'm having inappropriate variable and I'm applying appropriate statistical technique, then I'm going to commit wrong decision and I'm going to get inappropriate conclusions. Then if I'm having the appropriate variable but I'm performing inappropriate statistical technique, then what will happen? In that case, again I'm going to commit a wrong decision and I'm going to get inappropriate conclusion. And finally, if I'm having inappropriate variables and if I'm performing inappropriate statistical techniques, in that case also I'm going to commit wrong decision and I'm going to get the inappropriate conclusions. So the best practice, the best decision or the correct decision is you should always have the appropriate variables in the line of your objectives, and you should apply the appropriate statistical technique on those variables. Then and then only you are going to commit the correct decision, you are going to get the appropriate conclusions or the results. Now let me take you to the last slide of this lecture, and that is the objectives of this course. And these objectives that we already have mentioned in the very first lecture of this certificate course in the first week. So there were the four objectives. The first objective was enrich the learner's ability to process the data systematically through MS Excel and SPSS. Second objective was to construct the learner's capacity to read and interpret data scientifically. Third objective was to that the enable learners with the use of appropriate statistical techniques for expected result. And the last objective of this course was to equip learners with descriptive and inferential analytical skills using MS Excel and SPSS. And I hope that this certificate course could justify all these objectives. As of now, all the participants here are now able to process the data systematically using MS Excel and SPSS. I hope all the participants now can read and interpret the result, and they can read and interpret the data scientifically. They can choose appropriate statistical techniques on the basis of what type of data or what type of variables they do have. And I hope that all the participants of this course, certificate course, are now familiar with the descriptive and inferential analytical skills. I hope this certificate course could justify all these objectives. This certificate course could fulfill all these objectives. And with this with this will stop here, and I'm very thankful to all of you to choose this course and to complete this course. Thank you for your kind listening. After this lecture, we'll share you one feedback link. So I'll request you all to fill and submit that feedback form as soon as possible. Thank you for your kind listening and attending this certificate course. Thank you.